समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Kathak Clutter takes us to a most fascinating and intriguing part of the world today. It's a tiny country called Yemen. Tiny, you can see it on the map. It is, if you compare it with UAE, it's not quite tiny, it's large. If you compare it with Israel, it's actually quite large. But if you compare it with its immediate large neighbor, Saudi Arabia, it's quite small. In fact, even compared to the other state bordering it, Oman, it is not that large. However, compared to Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all the Asian states bordering Yemen. Yemen is a West Asian country, although a lot of our discussion today will take us to Africa. Africa is just a short distance away. You just jump over the Gulf of Aden or jump over the little pond there and you are in Africa. You are in Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia or Somaliland. You can choose to call it as you wish. This country, this unfortunate country of about 4.4 crore people has been broken. It's been a failed state since 2012. Until then, it was not really a failed state because it was a state divided into two, North Yemen and South Yemen. In 1990, they signed an agreement, the two sides, they came together, they became one government. 2012, this was one of the countries where the regime was pulled down by the Arab Spring. And since then, the country has not been put back together. At the very least, the country is divided between North and the South. But then this is complicated by the presence of the Houthis. The Houthis were the largest, by far, the largest, the best armed militant / terrorist group in the world. The best armed means they have an air force, they have attack helicopters, they have their armor, tanks, they have ballistic missiles, they have literally hundreds of ballistic missiles, if not thousands. Maybe if you count all ranges and things, there will be upwards of a couple of thousand. That many ballistic missiles, and we've seen them raining these over Israel and other places as well. All of this is collected in this hapless, unfortunate country called Yemen. This is where now, the reason we are talking about it is that this is where also the two brother Arab countries, the two allies, friends, partners, rich partners and rich neighbors, UAE and Saudi Arabia, have decided to fight their own little power struggle in the region. And this is happening in such a way that, and sometimes UAE and Saudi Arabia even say they are making peace, that they have common cause. But if they do, and if they bury the hatchet will be buried in the poor Yemenis' expendable back. See the map of Yemen. I will explain to you. First of all, see where Saudi Arabia is, where Oman is. Yemen has a border of 1,307 kilometers with Saudi Arabia. This is the softest of the soft underbellies of Saudi Arabia, because next to the border is just an empty expanse of sand. This is all desert area, impossible to guard, impossible to protect. You can't get enough armies to patrol it. You can't get enough sensors to make sure that nobody comes in. That is what that is what the Saudis really worry about. UAE is a bit far away. Between UAE and Yemen, there is Saudi Arabia and also Oman. So UAE is a bit far away. What's happening in Yemen is, and I will explain to you who controls what with the map. But in Yemen, the two countries, the two big powers in the Arab world, see their interests clashing, because UAE supports the idea of a divided Yemen. A divided Yemen means restoring status quo ante as it existed in May 1990, when the leaders of the two sides, North and the South, decided to come together and form one country. This was always a little bit of a difficult marriage. This was an agreement, as I told you, signed on signed in May 1990. On 2nd of August, the government led by Ali Abdullah Saleh came into power. This survived till 2012 until, until the Arab Spring broke it. After that, various warlords took control of various areas, but essentially the country split between the two sides. The southern side, where Aden being the most prominent urban center or city or the port town, that became the capital. In the northern side, it was Sana'a. Sana'a used to be the capital of United Yemen. Sana'a now, in the course of time, was taken over by the Houthis. So effectively, that has become the government of the Houthis. Now, Houthis, for all practical purposes, became the government of North Yemen. South Yemen was controlled by a government there, which was globally recognized, internationally recognized as the government of Yemen. That is where trouble has erupted now. We all know that Houthis have been fighting the Israelis, and again see the Red Sea coast of Yemen. Those ports are controlled by the Houthis. So port of Hodeidah, for example. Anytime you see Israeli bombing raids, you will see the name Hodeidah coming up because that port gets raided, bombed often by the Israelis and also by the Americans. Americans also raid Sana'a often, or they did over a 2-month campaign, after which the Houthis made some kind of a peace deal with the Americans, like honor among thieves. We will not bother with your shipping. We will not interfere with anything in the Red Sea. You would remember that for a fair bit of time, Houthis with their missiles had blocked all shipping in Red Sea. That is when a lot of the navies had gone to counter them. Even the Indian Navy had sent a bunch of ships there to counter these, also to try and intercept these missiles when possible. Houthis made that peace deal or some kind of a deal with the Americans, and since then they've not been interfering with the shipping. However, they've controlled this territory. So see the territory of Yemen. This is color coded. This tells you who controls who. So first of all, you see on the western side, that is area abutting Red Sea. Coastlines are valuable. All of the Red Sea coast is controlled by the Houthis. They have their capital at Sana'a, a stateless state, but definitely the most powerful stateless military force in the world, or the most powerful stateless state in the world. The entire southern side also runs along the coast. In this case, it's not the Red Sea, because between the Red Sea and Arabian Sea or Gulf of Aden, Arabian Sea begins with the Gulf of Aden, lies Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Bab el-Mandeb is a choke point. At its narrowest, it's only 29 kilometers. So it's quite easy to block. And that is what the Houthis were saying. As you come in through the Bab el-Mandeb, you come into the Gulf of Aden and then go into the Arabian Sea. It's a very lucrative shipping route. A lot of the world's commercial shipping goes through Bab el-Mandeb. In fact, most of the west to east traffic, say Indian exports to Europe, Indian exports to America, or similarly European American exports to India, they will come through Suez Canal and then ultimately through the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea. That's why it becomes such an important choke point. If you escape the Houthis, however, or have a deal with them, and you are able to cross Bab el-Mandeb and come into Arabian Sea, then for quite some distance you are running alongside Aden's southern coast. That is South Aden. Now South Aden again is a very important piece of real estate. Let me take a short detour to explain some concepts to you. You know these concepts, but I'm taking some liberties with these given the context of Yemen. So there is something that is called a resource curse. Sometimes a country can have resources, but if its government doesn't run well, its rulers are bad, it does not have stability, it becomes a resource curse. Example, Venezuela. Example, Democratic Republic of Congo. Example, Sudan, and so on. But you know, when a country like Saudi Arabia or UAE or China, they have resources, they don't have such a problem. Those resources then become their assets. Or America or Canada, they have humongous resources, but they have good systems, strong governments, political stability, those resources become a strength. So their resources don't become a... If you have a poorly run government and instability, then resources become a curse. Resources also become a curse when a dictatorial power seizes your country and says, all right, I have all this money coming out of my soil. I can use this money to do what I want and push my ideology, not just on my people, but across the world, wherever I have reached. That example is Iran. What happens to a country that does not have resources? Sometimes that country might have geostrategic positioning. Geostrategic positioning, look at Israel. No resources, but geostrategically sitting on top of the Arab world, tiny country, but a tiny Western country for all practical purposes, a tiny Western European country for all practical purposes, sitting on top of Asia, by the side of Africa, but right on top of the vast area where bulk of the world's Islamic powers live and Islamic populations live, coming right up to Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal. Yes, we have large populations in Indonesia, Malaysia, and a few more. Brunei, for example, in Southeast Asia. Brunei, for example, in Brunei, for example, but those are a little bit different. Remember, let me underline to you that both Indonesia and Malaysia do not describe themselves as Islamic republics. Malaysia still has Islam as its state religion. Indonesia does not even say that. Indonesia, for all practical purposes, has a secular constitution. Israel, therefore, is a good example of geostrategic location becoming such a big asset. The Western world will never let Israel ever be in trouble from which it cannot come out. Israel will remain dominant in its objectives, it will be protected, it will be provided for, so on and so forth. That is geostrategic location. Now, what happens when you don't have resources? You don't have a geostrategic location, maybe some of it's there, but you have geography. Now, this geography could be your advantage, but this geography, particularly if you are a failed state, becomes your curse. That is the situation with Yemen. Yemen's geography places it in the later quarter or the southernmost quarter of the Arabian Peninsula. All the rest of which is quite resource rich, quite oil rich, and quite wealthy. Yemen, on the other hand, has got left out. Yemen has some oil in its southeastern areas, but only some oil. That oil also is now controlled by a warlord. So what happens to a country like that? That country then becomes a playground for all the powers in the region, and they all come and fight their proxy wars there. That's how the Iranians came in first. They adopted the Houthis. Houthis are drawn from the Shia population in Yemen. All of Yemen is 65% Sunni, 35% Shia. 35% of 4.4 crores is a lot of people. It's about 1.25 crore people. It's from them that the Houthis have been built. Houthis at any point of time have a serving quote-unquote army, usually uniformed, of nearly 3.5 lakh people. I did not say for no reason that Houthis are the largest non-state army in the world. Iranians came in first. 2012, I told you the country broke up. When Saleh fell, the country lost its center of gravity. And that's when other forces also started coming in and playing. And warlords came in. And then the warlords between them figured out that the way was to divide the country again between north and the south, while the Houthis had their own empire. Houthis, of course, would have liked to take all of the north, but that is not something that either the Saudis wanted or UAE wanted. That when we last heard, Saudis and UAE were fighting together against the Houthis in Yemen. That's true. That was the case. Both were using their assets of all kinds, including air power and missiles. In some cases, that air power is also helped with refueling by American aircraft. As a matter of fact, until the Saudis and the UAE came in, it looked like Houthis will overrun Yemen because they were such a powerful force, and that is not something that the Sunni Arab states, that is Saudi Arabia and UAE, particularly Saudis, because it was so close to them, they would not want it. They would not want Iran to effectively rule Yemen, a state next to their soft underbelly, or what I described earlier as the softest of soft underbellies. That's how UAE and Saudi Arabia came together. That's when we also saw some missile attacks by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia and also in UAE as well. But that was history. That is now over because equations in Yemen have changed. Houthis do not control as much as they used to. Houthis are pushed on the defensive. However, they are holding on to the territory that you see on the map on your screen. That's the territory along the Red Sea that Houthis hold, including the port of Hodeida and the city of Sana'a. The rest of it was under a different dispensation. This dispensation was set up jointly by UAE and Saudis, large Saudi patronage, but UAE was part of it. This is called, remember I'm saying this is called, not this was called. This is called Presidential Leadership Council. This was a conglomeration of all warlords and other groups of various types who came together to set up a government in Aden, first of all to control all of southern Yemen, to expand the definition of southern Yemen as much as possible, and to ultimately unite Yemen. In the course of time, however, it seems that the UAE decided that they had a greater interest not in Yemen getting reunited. Maybe they thought that that's an impractical thought because Houthis can't be pushed away. Houthis are much too powerful. Maybe they'll be better off if the country gets divided, if they can have a hold over southern Yemen. Because a hold over southern Yemen means controlling the access to Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf on one side and to the Red Sea on the other, and also then watching the Horn of Africa. I told you that I'm starting with an unfortunate Asian state, but this will take us to Africa. That's the ambition that UAE had. What was the first indication of this ambition? On 2nd of December, one of the groups in this Presidential Leadership Council based in Aden, controlling most of southern Yemen, they started to take a contrary position in combat. That's the group called Southern Transitional Council. Now, the name itself is a giveaway in terms of what does the group want. The group wants to consolidate southern Yemen into one state. They are not to be bothered so much about what the Houthis control or what's happening in North Yemen. They need a well-defined territory in southern Yemen. To that extent, they broke away from PLC and started fighting also against PLC's forces or forces of warlords aligned with the PLC. And that pushed the PLC out of Aden. For some time, STC also came in control of Aden. That went on for some time, and then the Saudis say they will accept no more of it. And the Saudis came in and they started carrying out their own bombing runs, and the relationship between the Saudis and UAE became very wrought, after which UAE said that they were withdrawing their forces from Yemen and there was going to be some kind of a thaw between the Saudis and the UAE. I told you that they decided that if they were to bury the hatchet, they will bury the hatchet in the backs of the hapless, expendable Yemenis. Now, please take a close look at this color-coded map of unfortunate Yemen. And once you see it, then you will know why I call it unfortunate. So, the territory along the Red Sea, territory to the west along the Red Sea is all controlled by the Houthis, including the port of Hodeida, very important, and the city of Sana'a, the former capital of United States of Yemen. Then as you come south, most of the south is controlled today by STC, that is the Southern Transitional Council, which was a faction until December 2, which was a faction of PLC. That is the Presidential Leadership Council, which is a conglomerate of various warlords and groups. In between them, some area, and that is shaded green, some area was still with the PLC, but they were pushed northwards. They seem to be coming back now because STC has been stopped in its tracks. And you know what? How dramatic the pace of events is that even as I'm recording this, word comes that STC, or the Southern Transitional Council, has decided to disband itself and shut down all its offices. So whatever happened in Saudi Arabia, particularly with the hopefully temporary disappearance of these 60 leaders of STC, has made this decisive difference. Then you come further down and you see other areas. On the southern side, on the southeastern side, as you get close to Oman or close to Arabian Sea, you have the province of Hadramaut. Province of Hadramaut is controlled by Hadrami elite forces, which is also a faction of STC, which is backed by UAE as STC is. This, however, is led by a warlord who's described by Newsline magazine, and I'm sharing the article with you, as the 40-year-old oil tycoon, because this is the region of Yemen which still has some oil and he controls it. He's put his troops there. His name is Amr bin Hebresh. He's only 40 years old. You can see his picture. Looks quite young also looks happy from whatever I can see. Then if you see the extreme southwestern side, a sliver of territory there is controlled by, not by Houthi forces. This is just underneath the Houthi controlled area. That is the Yemeni National Resistance Forces. This faction is also backed by the UAE. And then you can again see that the large areas which STC controls now abut provinces of Saudi Arabia and also Oman as well. And all of that has added to anxieties there. Now, while at one level it looks like quite a nasty fight for supremacy in Yemen between UAE and Saudi Arabia, at other levels it also looks like a friendly fight. So what happened? 2nd of December, I told you, that is when STC started their offensive. They broke away from PLC. PLC, as the name indicates, is a council. It has many factions, apparently with a common purpose, out of which STC broke away. It's a council of various groups fighting there, including warlords. But this is the government of Yemen, which is internationally recognized and also is fully backed by Saudi Arabia. There was a suspicion when Mohammed bin Salman met Donald Trump. There was a suspicion, looks like, I read this in international media, that the UAE thought that he had gone to complain about UAE and he wanted sanctions against the fighting group in Sudan, right? It's all about resources and poor countries in Africa. The fighting groups in Sudan, the group that UAE supports is a group called RSF. That is Rapid Support Forces. That is led by a mercurial general called Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or also known by his nickname Hemedti. That is the faction that the UAE is supporting. The Saudis, on the other hand, would support the other side, which is the Sudanese armed forces. And once again, the Saudis would want that country to remain intact and be with Saudi armed forces. The UAE has blocked its interest on the other side, and UAE is supporting that side even with weapons, just as the UAE is supporting one side, that is Haftar's side, with Libya. All these places look very far from where we sit, but once you go to Sudan, Libya is not that far. Saudi Arabia and UAE are also locked in a tussle for supremacy and control in all of these poor African areas, inhabited mostly by Arab Sunni Muslim populations. Now, things moved quite dramatically this week, which is the reason we are talking about this today. This Tuesday, the Saudis said that people who are fighting against the PLC and trying to grab more area on the southern side and declaring maybe a return of southern Yemen as a separate state, they will be kicked out of PLC. When that happened, then STC and its leader Edaros al-Zubaydi, they got into a bit of a funk. So some of them decided to go for talks to Saudi Arabia. 60 of them disappeared. They went to Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia issued a statement saying talks have been taking place. Soon enough, a statement will be issued about the outcome of the talks. The STC itself said that the people had been kidnapped or they had been taken away. They didn't know where they were. However, one of them was clever. One of them was too smart to be caught in Saudi Arabia, and that was the leader of STC. That is Edaros al-Zubaydi. Edaros al-Zubaydi, the Saudis this Thursday issued a dramatic statement. They said, where has Zubaydi gone? He was taken onto a boat. Saudis have given the name of the boat. That boat took him to some place in what is now called sometimes Somaliland, but a part of Somalia, the other side of Gulf of Aden. So that takes us to Africa. From there, he was taken by plane to Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And from Mogadishu, he was taken by an IL-76. And it's an IL-76 that apparently UAE has used often in its arms supply operations in Libya, Sudan, Yemen, places like that, all the places where Emirati power is involved. In fact, if you read this Saudi statement, it's quite dramatic in the sense that it tells you at which point does this plane turn on its transponder, when does it turn it off its transponder. And then it says that the plane landed with Zubaydi at an Emirati airbase called Al Reef. Now, Zubaydi, the leader, maybe he could read the writing on the wall. So as he was kicked out of PLC by the Saudis, he went missing. So while his colleagues went to Saudi Arabia for talks, he wasn't to be found there. He went missing, and his patrons, the Emiratis, then took over his future, because they apparently took him away, or that is at least what the Saudis are charging, that they took him away from there to Somaliland or Somalia, and eventually to an airbase in UAE. Now, this discussion will not be complete unless we go to Africa. So cross Bab el Mandeb with me, come to Africa. I told you Bab el Mandeb at its narrowest is only 29 kilometers. As you come to Africa, what do you see? You see Eritrea to the west, then Djibouti, then Somalia. In fact, the part of Somalia which is Somaliland, which since 1991 has pretty much run as an autonomous entity. That is what Israel has now recognized as a separate country. No other country has done so, but Israel has done so, and there is a reason there, because each of these countries, whether it's Eritrea, but even more Djibouti and Somalia, they also suffer from the geography curse. They don't have resources, but they suffer from the geography curse, because each one is located critically overlooking some of the world's most crucial and vulnerable sea lanes. Look at Djibouti, for example. Djibouti is a tiny country. In fact, it's the tiniest African country. African countries tend to be large. It's the tiniest African country. Djibouti is just 23,200 square kilometers, which is about the size of Meghalaya or Manipur. Only that large, with 1 million people or thereabouts, maybe give or take 50,000, just over a million people. However, you might say it has a geographical curse because it has no resources, it has very little income of its own, but it is sitting in a place where anybody sitting can block the access from Arabian Sea to Red Sea and vice versa. At the same time, anybody sitting there can protect their own shipping. That's why tiny Djibouti becomes a very unusual place, a very unusual nation, which houses the basis of not one power but two powers. In fact, the sole superpower of the world and the deputy superpower of the world. They have an American base, Camp Lemonnier, which, by the way, is the largest American base in Africa, on the African continent. And I know you will jump and say, what about Diego Garcia? But Diego Garcia effectively is neither Asian nor African. It sits in the middle. In any case, it's not on the African continent. On the African continent, Camp Lemonnier is the largest base that the Americans have. Not far from that, given how small Djibouti is, the Chinese also have a base which they built in 2017. So both sit there, cheek by jowl, or as we might say in India, tere ghar ke samne. They are both there staring at each other. Similarly, when you come southeast from Djibouti, you come to that part of Somalia which is now called Somaliland. There already the Israelis have some sort of a base, and there is plenty in Israeli publications that says that Israelis are now negotiating with the Somaliland quote-unquote government to set up a larger presence there. What do the Israelis gain there? Israelis gain access again to Arabian Sea and to Red Sea, but also from there they can run operations against the Houthis much more effectively, and also Houthis get much less of an escape route. And maybe tomorrow, if any alliances were to come up between, say, the Houthis and the Somali pirates or Somali militias, that can be curbed. This is also, Somaliland is where UAE also wants to set up bases, and that leads to the understanding that UAE and Israelis may be working in some kind of cooperation because their interests converge in the area. Now, the countries that are most triggered by this are the Saudis, because they don't want this going on, and also the Turks. And that's why Erdogan has been talking both to the ruler of UAE and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to try and bring about some kind of a truce. At the same time, Turkey has built its own largest foreign base in Somalia. Now, Turkey being there, and also Turkey is talking to Egypt, It's complicated because just as I was saying earlier, that Libya seems far from here, but doesn't seem far if you are starting from Sudan, and Sudan doesn't look far if you are starting from Yemen or Egypt. At the same time, Somalia looks far and Ethiopia looks even further. But the fact is that Somalia and Ethiopia have a border. Ethiopia and Egypt have a problem because they share a river. Ethiopia has been harnessing the waters of those rivers, and Egyptians have a problem. That is one of the quote-unquote wars that Donald Trump claims to have settled. But if you see where Ethiopia is and where Egypt is, they have thousands of kilometers between their borders. In fact, they have all of Sudan between their borders. However, they share a river, and this river actually becomes a much bigger river in Sudan because that's where the two streams of Nile also meet. Egypt thereby vicariously gets interested in this area, and Turkey and Saudi Arabia in that case also can help, or at least promise or give hope to the Egyptians that they will help by keeping the Ethiopians busy in this area, so that they are at their best behavior when it comes to the Nile River waters in their own dispute with Egypt. I think I will conclude this chapter here. The reason I say this chapter is because I know all of you are smart and you will jump at me and saying, you didn't talk much about Somalia. We've been watching Somalia, the movies, Black Hawk Down. We've been watching stories of pirates. We've just had the Somaliland issue with Israel recognizing it. Somalia, I think, is by itself a story to be told one day in a standalone Cut the Clutter. And if you've been following Cut the Clutter, you know that Africa, all of the commentariat, all of your TV channels, etc., may be missing Africa because they don't think it's so important. But Cut the Clutter keeps going to Africa, and I'm happy to note that our African episodes have very good following and very good engagement.